welcome to Jeremy Hillman. Hi,
G'day,
Jeremy.
Rebecca. Hi, how you going?
I'm going well. So the first question is just to give us a bit of background, although a lot of us know it. Last summer, New South Wales recorded its most devastating bushfire season on record. So just give us a bit of a background on the impact of those fires.
Sure. I should start off too by saying I am with an organisation called Resilience New South Wales these days, and we are with the Department of Premier and Cabinet now rather than Department of Justice, but up until recently we certainly were. Look, I know Shane Fitzsimmons touched on some of the stats on Tuesday when he spoke, so just to reinforce, there was approximately 2,500 homes that were destroyed. 25 lives were lost, including a number of firefighters. 5.5 million hectares were burned, which is roughly the size of a country like Croatia. There was something like 2.7 million cubic metres of waste generated, plus, of course, countless impact on communities, on wildlife, on infrastructure, and that cost is still being counted. But of course, that's come on top of a severe drought in many parts of New South Wales, which has compounded the trauma and the impact for so many people, especially in those drought-impacted areas. And of course, we've had COVID for the last couple of months, which has obviously complicated some activities as well.
It's been extraordinary times. And to get through them, we need a good team. So tell me a little bit about the people that you've been working with through all these events.
Sure. Well, I've been working with an amazing array of people, but from our organisation, we were Office of Emergency Management last year, and we were a core team of just two, myself and Callie Sheehan, but we obviously had identified people that we would use to surge. So we have a surge program where when a disaster is of a certain size, we call in people. So we expanded quite rapidly. We brought in a number of secondees into our office in Sydney. We got as many people on the ground as we could as well, and people that had regional or local connections too. And we're now a much larger team, but in particular, it was, I'd like to acknowledge Callie, who did an extraordinary job managing the comms in head office while I was on the road. So lots and lots of people to thank, of course, but Callie in particular.
Tell me about the challenges that you faced. I can already hear that you needed more people to do it. What were you responding to?
Definitely, look, obviously, the scale of this necessitated a drastic increase in staff across the board, and that's true for every agency or charity that might have been working in this space. One of the standard challenges that we know every time from a comms perspective is how do we get accurate, consistent information and support to people as quickly and efficiently as possible. The bigger the disaster, the more voices there are, the more potential misinformation there is. So there's a lot of work that we do on the ground, partnering with councils, partnering with local knowledge and community champions to get information out there. And we've got a fairly sophisticated program of working with community influencers. We know that as everyone knows, not everyone listens to government or trusts the voice of government. So the more that we can get partnerships and messages out locally from other people can really enhance that. We also greatly increased where we put that information. So not just usual channels of media releases and interviews and councils, but we thought a lot harder about where anybody might go for information that might be to their local MP's office, to their GP clinic, at their school, and we tried to get that information to as many of those places as possible to get that information quickly to people. In terms of scale, obviously that was a challenge with active fires. So in the north for many months, the fires were raging from basically August, September onwards, and in many places different fires were threatening the same communities. So you've got places like Drake up in the north that were hit by fires a year ago, but they also had weeks of being on high alert, and that meant also weeks of recovery being interrupted. We know that recovery starts at impact, and that the best way is for us to get on the ground early. But when you've got active fires, you can't get people to as many places as you would like. You can't get fodder supplies in with trucks, and that was a constant complication in the early stages. We still managed to get there in most cases, often with escorts from fire or police. And of course, we had the ADF and others helping with a lot of those logistics and emergency drops.
One of the unusual aspects of this was that it was so long lasting, and it was impacting different communities at different times. And the event, some people were right at the point of response, other people were in recovery, and that could change depending on the behaviour of the fires. How did you manage that complexity? What did you have to do differently?
Sure. Well, I suppose coming into any disaster, we already know that there's going to be chaos, and we come in knowing that every disaster is different, every community is different. We know that we've got to be nimble, that we may have some ideas and some expertise, but we know that we have to adapt that very quickly. So in that sense, we're reasonably prepared. But obviously, many of the challenges around the fire impacting at different times meant that people were on different tracks of recovery. And particularly as the south burned months later, you've then got issues around information can go everywhere, but you've got to try and tailor it to those particular areas. And of course, there will be comparisons of what's happened in a different area. But one of the things that I think was fantastic, and Shane touched on it the other day, was a partnership with Service New South Wales, our sort of customer service department. One of the big challenges that we had for people in disasters, and I think we all face, is how do people access support? And we had a situation where we would have a newsletter or information that had 17 different phone numbers. Call the animal agriculture hotline for an animal problem, call the mental health line if you want that support, or call the Rural Assistance Authority if you're a farmer. And it was confusing for everybody, and obviously not ideal. So we've got this fantastic partnership with Service New South Wales, where they created a bushfire customer care team, one phone number, one website, and the physical footprint that they have across regional New South Wales as well meant people could go in there. So that kicked in January. So that in the south, that was a lot more used, but it's hopefully a model that we will use more consistently into the future.
Obviously, one of your roles was an integration between the work you did and communities and the councils. Tell me a little bit about that engagement and how you focused on that.
Sure. Look, engagement means different things to different people, either in comms or a community engagement space. But for me, it's how we interact with people on the ground, and how that then enhances our comms. The better we're listening, the better we're connected with people on the ground, the better we can tailor our communications and our wider recovery support as well. So I guess there's a twin focus from my perspective when we get onto the ground, and that's to engage with and support councils and then also communities. We sincerely recognise that council is the most important tier of government in recovery, full stop. The state can provide things, the Commonwealth can provide things, but it's councils that live and are of these communities and who are there for the long term as well. So that approach means that we go into council saying, how can we help? We don't come and say, we're here to do X, Y, and Z. And it's a sincere partnership, and I'm very proud of our approach and the way that we go about that, because I think we genuinely do recognise that connection and that partnership. So we will, from a comms perspective, we connect in very quickly and very closely with council comms teams now. David from Clarence Valley, who spoke the other day, I'm not sure if you're online, but we worked with Clarence along with many others to basically support. We know that council's got a crazy amount of work to do regardless of the disaster. So there's the BAU plus everything on top. A lot of councils don't have big comms teams. In regional areas, they may not even have a comms person or a part-time person. So it's about identifying where there's capacity constraints, and we've now got dedicated council comms liaison people. And Kirsty, who might be on the line today as well, has done an amazing job supporting that, where it's a very tailored council by council approach to support them. In terms of community, obviously we try to get on the ground and force multiply with councils and other partners. We're quite often the first representatives that interact with impacted people, especially when we get out to those areas that have been blocked otherwise from the fires. So we're dealing with people that have obviously just been through a lot of trauma and are not in a great way. But it's really vital that we get there early to as many places as we can for them to be seen and heard. A lot of the spiral that happens with communities in the days and weeks from recovery, from impact, is them not feeling seen and not feeling heard. And by being present there very early, we can really build those. And the Mayor of Christchurch talked about it too. How do we build trust and how do we build relationships? Well, a large part of that is getting there early, listening, following up, and building that authentic connection.
So what were some of the distractions, the key sort of messaging problems you needed to solve?
Well, there's always distractions. I think one of the big ones, every disaster that we face, is donated goods. I know we've talked about this at previous EMPAs before, but it is sometimes referred to as the second disaster, which may sound a bit melodramatic, but when you're on the ground in these communities and semi-trailer loads of goods are lining up, and these trucks have come in from Brisbane and Perth and Adelaide and wherever else, what is a beautiful thing from people seeing these fires and wanting to help quickly becomes actually quite a negative issue. And we have communities begging us when we turn up to please try and help them take away or stop the goods. We know that we can only do so much in terms of that messaging, and increasingly we do that no goods message a lot earlier, but it's tricky because we can't interfere with local communities organising themselves. So at a local level, someone might say on Facebook, hey, we need some jerry cans or some generators or something. That might then spread and generators arrive from all over Australia. But at a local level, that's fine. It's when the unsolicited goods happen, usually from state and national media magnifying, that we end up having this huge problem. And in small towns, they might only have one local hall, and that gets filled to the brim with donated goods. These people then can't use that space for their own recovery and other activities.
And lots of time and resources get spent on managing that need to go somewhere else.
They do. That's right. Locals have to store it, dispose of it, all that sort of thing. So what we've tried to do a bit more is encourage local voices. Again, knowing that as government, we can say certain things, but that where we can get locals to do it. And I think there's a video, I'm not sure if we're going to play it now or later, where we sent a film crew into Nimboida, an impacted area, where we got their voices, which was a really, really powerful ad campaign. And even just encouraging smaller groups on their Facebook pages to shoot little videos and ask people to please stop donating is another really useful technique. But it's a big problem, and it's something that I think needs to be addressed outside of disasters, in partnership with charities and other organisations about how we can have more consistent messaging around donations.
Long-term messaging. I think we've got access to that video now, so we'll play it.
Great.
First of all, thank you.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you
for supporting us in this catastrophe.
It's really amazing how many people want to help.
Our experience with emergencies
show that donations of money, no matter how big
or small,
help affected communities get back on their feet.
We appreciate your donations can come in many forms.
But right now, money matters most.
If you want to donate,
money makes the difference
to lives that have changed forever.
Something else I wanted to ask you about was the layering of one crisis emergency over another. So these were communities dealing with and trying to recover from and become resilient to the fires, and then COVID-19 hits. Talk a little to that one.
Sure. Well, thankfully, to some extent, COVID was a little later on in recovery. If it had hit in the very early recovery, it would have been a whole different set of problems. But it certainly interrupted a lot of the face-to-face engagement, and which council and many of us other agencies had been doing. One of the things that we did to help with that was offer councils some WebEx video conferencing tools and working with them on comms and engagement tips and things that we could still do through COVID. So everyone had to adapt, and on the whole, I think that obviously people understand if we can't be on the ground, but I think councils in particular have led the way in continuing that local engagement, and we're now getting teams back out in the field, which is great. So it was certainly an additional challenge, and of course that impact of there was campaigns being run to get people back into the regions to support these impacted communities, and that's obviously been that economic recovery has been delayed as well.
I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll come back to you at the end. Having one number and one website is great, but how do the community then get to the service they need? For example, quite specifically, if no water is connected, or there are trees over their driveway, or how do they get those specific needs met?
Sure. Well, yeah, obviously the number and the website are just one part of that. And in the very early stages, when we're talking about trying to reconnect power and those sorts of very immediate challenges, there's people on the ground identifying those needs, and it often comes through a variety of channels. People will report their issues through where they're comfortable. That's often council. It's sometimes their MP's office. As we get on the ground more and more, it's through us. But certainly we don't assume, particularly that we do anything digitally that we can't also replicate on the ground. And I think it's an important point, particularly for regional areas and for elderly people in particular, that we're always looking through the lens of, this is great if we can have this digital element, but how can we also speak to those people that may not be able to access that?
Absolutely. Another question: many in Canberra rushed to donate goods and money to our affected areas on the south coast of New South Wales. Local groups popped up to donate a range of goods and services. Do you work with the ACT government to help coordinate all this effort?
As far as I'm aware, not with the ACT government. I know there are parts of our agency that do. In terms of the messaging, we were trying to get that, hold off on donated goods. Obviously the subtext there is, if a local community group has said, hey, we need a whole bunch of shovels and tarps or whatever, then we've got to try and distinguish between that, which is a great and appropriate sort of matching service. But the wider message is, please don't load up semi-trailers and start collection drives in other parts of New South Wales and Australia and just send things to places. And Callie and myself and others in our team do it quite manually, where we hear about a radio drive or the media are often promoting this lovely person in Wagga who's doing a collection, and we'll jump on the phone to those media outlets and try to speak to those people and try to help them understand that as wonderful as what they're doing is, it's actually unlikely to be helpful for those people on the ground. And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have. Not everyone loves it. There are some people who say, well, I'm doing it now, bad luck. But most do understand when you talk them through it a little bit more.
There are always communities who feel like they didn't get the right information that they needed at the right time. How can an overarching organisation like yours work and support to fill those gaps?
That's an incredibly difficult challenge. I think every disaster with every agency that's dealing with this in any jurisdiction. I think to reinforce how important it is that we get on the ground, I'll give an example of a small community in Ewingar, which is a tiny little place. The closest main town's about 90 minutes away in Casino, but it's in the Clarence Valley sort of area. They were a tiny group. They only have a community hall. They don't have a town per se, but they were a group that was starting to feel very left out. Obviously, in the early stages when the media is showing all of the images and destruction, the media can only get to certain places or focus on certain areas. So smaller communities will then often feel ignored just simply because there wasn't the media side to it.
Yeah.
So we have a really important task of getting to those places early. Uingar, through a couple of different intelligence channels, both through our social media and our welfare teams on the ground, were telling us that they were feeling, seriously ignored. So we were able to work on that, and I personally was up in the region at the time, spent a lot of time with the hall committee folk who were sort of the guardians of the community. They'd been feeding people, and people who had evacuated and were living at the hall, and they were just exhausted and traumatized, obviously. But what was initially a fairly hostile environment for us, we managed to turn around. We went to wasn't quite a community meeting. They have a fortnightly dinner at the hall, and it was their Oktoberfest night. I remember there was lederhosen and schnitzels and all of that. And the hall committee sort of invited us, but sort of said, look, we're not sure how welcome you're going to be, but there might be some people that could do with your help and information. So we negotiated to be in a separate area around the site. I'm not sure, there's some images I've supplied of the Uingar hall and people there. I'm not sure if that's displaying or not. But the point is, we went there, we adapted for them. We didn't tell them this is what we're going to do to you. We said, how can we help you? What do you need? And then that gradually turned into a beautiful relationship where we came back and had a few barbecues. We brought the Governor General along for a visit. But the people, I think, really realised that, sure, we're from government, but we're real humans, we're empathetic, authentic, and really, really care. And you can only overcome that by being there and being consistent, by listening and doing what you say you're going to do.
One of the things that that's really interesting to me there is your comment about we set up around the corner. It's as emergency communications and recovery agencies, we often want to be there to help, but we can only appropriately be as close as people want us to be.
That's a good point. And that's right. And it's that difference of coming in and Leadbeater sometimes talks about that whole, oh, we've arrived, here's the cavalry. It's like, well, no, we're not the cavalry. We're a partner in this broad, horrible time that people are going through. And I'm very proud of the way our organisation embodies that community-centred approach. Shane, our new commissioner, also comes from that space as well. And I think we do slowly and gradually have that opportunity to win over hearts and minds, or at least rub off some of the cynicism. A lot of people are cynical about government and support. And I think it takes me to another point about going where the people are. Like, if we hold a community meeting in a main area and say, oh, there's a community impacted there 20 minutes away, they'll be able to come. No, they probably won't, or they won't feel like it's for them. So we have mobile outreach teams that we start to do drop-ins at tiny little impacted areas. That's a huge resource. We're asking other agencies and councils and partners and Red Cross to come and sit in remote places and hope people will come. And sometimes only a few people come. And sometimes they won't come for weeks because word of mouth hasn't said it's worth it yet. But I guess my point there is to be really nimble, not just do these town hall type meetings as well. Go where people are. A pub, my favourite example is we often go to these little towns, and if we're lucky, there's a hall and a pub. I'll always drag some of my staff over to the pub before or after the meeting, because we know almost without fail that's where the blokes are. Often the older blokes, the farmers, the people who might be a bit more cynical. They're certainly not the ones who are going across to the community meeting. Yeah. And you spend a few minutes in their place with them, and the cynicism that they initially had can wear down when they realise, oh, actually, there's some support here that might be useful. In the past, they've been put off, but you can reassure people. And again, you're out on the ground and you're going into these places, and people see that and notice that and feel, appreciated.
So you mentioned Shane Fitzsimmons. we heard him talking about the work with Resilience New South Wales. What does resilience mean for you and your team as you progress through out of recovery?
Well, it's exciting that we are now part of Resilience New South Wales, and that we've got Shane over from the RFS. He's obviously a very well-established leader and respected leader in this space. And so I think we're only going to grow in terms of our mission and the work that we're able to do. And in particular, obviously outside of disasters, the work is in preparedness and resilience building. We're really lucky, I think, to have someone like Shane who really embodies that people-centered approach. And there's work we're doing in the regions with community resilience networks and finding ways that we can build on these partnerships so we're ready to go better next time, but also through that preparedness resilience space. We know that communities that are better prepared for disaster fare better when disaster happens. So a big part of our mission is to build that preparedness through local council networks, regional networks and community networks.
And do you see a role for working with influencers? We had a question here about working with influencers for official fundraisers in the future. Is that something that as an organisation you might be interested in?
Sure. I guess from a community point of view, there's influencers that we work with in terms of the CWA or the publican or the post office manager. Those sorts of influencers are the most crucial ones. If the question's around more celebrity influencers,
I don't think so.
That.
Not about Instagram.
Good. Okay, cool. I could speak for a long time on that, and I'd love to, because it's a massively important part of what we do. And when we're identifying stakeholders and working with councils and communities, we have to find the people that the locals are coming to. And in a small town, guaranteed it's the post office, guaranteed it's the pub, guaranteed it's the cafe or the doctor. So building trust and relationships with these people so they can disseminate information is incredibly important, because they're listened to more than us. But more importantly too, they're an intelligence source back through us. So I can call the post office or the pub and say, how are people doing? Are there people coming in and seeing you that haven't come to us yet, that you could potentially encourage? And sometimes that's calls saying there's someone living in a burnout shipping container who's about to die, and can we get welfare there? So it's building those networks, which takes time, it takes personnel on the ground, but it's the only way to do it.
And it's a constant job. It's not something that kicks in when the emergency occurs.
From a council perspective, and local communities, yes, it's constant. I guess we come in on those bigger disasters and try to tap into those existing networks. The other thing to watch for is Facebook always has an explosion of new groups to support the disaster. Usually one or two of them for each community will coalesce as the main place for info. So building a relationship with the administrators of those pages and helping get info out there is incredibly important as well.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your time and your insights and your hard work. And
thank you. Sure. No, I was just going to say, I wanted to acknowledge there's an incredible amount of people in recovery that do amazing work and are very invisible. I'm lucky to work for an organisation where we can speak like this and share some of the experience. But I'd just like to shout out to all those incredible people, the mental health nurses, the service club volunteers, and everyone who do that beautiful, often invisible work to support in recovery.
Yeah, and I echo that thanks and appreciation of that incredible work that needs to be done by so many people in our communities in order for the community to recover and heal. Thank you, Jeremy.